Welcome to the final thoughts of Unlocking the Dream Vision and the Exodus and Beyond. I'm your host, author RJ von-Bruening. In these last few videos, we'll be exploring the rest of the story that brings all this ancient esoteric knowledge into our modern world. I'd also like to let everyone know that my very first book, The Forbidden Knowledge of Enoch, is now once again available as a second edition. The link is below. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to hit the like button below and subscribe for future videos. This series presents information based in part upon theory and conjecture of the system of esoteric symbolism. The purpose is to suggest some possible interpretation, but not necessarily the only one to the many mysteries we will explore. We pick our story back up thousands of years after the destruction and long after the mysterious individual remembered as Viracocha had returned to the sea. This brings us to a time starting sometime around 4,500 BC to about 4,000 BC on our current calendar, when the climate began to once again change into the patterns that we still experience today. One of the major effects of this climate change was the creation of the vast empty wasteland now known as the Sahara Desert from the once lush grasslands with ample water it once held during the last ice age. This was just one of the many major climate changes that occurred around this time. This climate change had the effect of forcing people alive at the time to begin moving around in great ebbs and flows across the lands of the old world in search of new sources of food and places to live. In this turmoil of racial comings and goings that both enriched and disrupted the entire area of the old world, these people began to re-enter the river valleys and started rediscovering the ruins of the ancient cities. This is one of the most important aspects of what happened since the Great Destruction that's hidden within the esoteric belief systems. Because as people began to re-enter these ancient abandoned cities, they rediscovered most of the knowledge that we still have today about this ancient world. But more importantly, they began claiming it for themselves. Why exactly this great movement of people began to happen cannot be exactly explained. But the overwhelming presumption is that it was the root cause was not only of climate change, but also possibly more important was one of overpopulation of the lands that the people came from in general. This appears to have forced people to have to start working together to defend themselves from other groups and also fighting over resources. The ones that found and occupied the ancient cities would have gained a great military advantage over the ones that had not. As they searched these cities, they rediscovered the ancient world and began claiming it for themselves. It is also highly likely that they also encountered the last remnants of Cro-Magnon man that could still be surviving and living in these ancient ruined cities. As our ancestors began moving into the river valleys and the old cities, they either wiped out anybody living there or they mated with them until they just disappeared. It is also possible that due to the great change that was made to us during the Grand Transformation, we were able to still continue to breed with Cro-Magnon man, but the result would always be us, Homo sapiens sapien, thereby breeding Cro-Magnon man out of existence. This is one of the more likely scenarios that would have allowed our ancestors to learn the secrets of the ancient world. But more recently, there has been evidence discovered to suggest that some type of great war may have occurred during this time. A mysterious war that appears to have resulted in the deaths of upwards of 90 to 95% of all males across the old world. How this new information affects everything is at the moment rather unknown, but it must have been a major factor in why people were moving around at this ancient time. It could also be an indication of that this was a war as people moved into the old areas as they moved around. Time will tell which scenario is the right one. But, for example, this movement of all these people allows us to realize and understand that the people who settled in the lands and islands of, say, Greece and reoccupied the ancient Greek cities, over time they began identifying themselves as being Greek, Over time, they began not only calling themselves Greek, but they also began claiming all the ancient Greek culture as their own. And after just a few generations, the people came to believe that they were actually the descendants of the ancient Greek people and its culture, whether or not they were actually descended from these people originally. Whereas now we know that through the dream vision and through the esoteric knowledge that this is actually not even physically possible, because the ancient Greek people that built these cities and this culture we call ancient Greece were our immediate ancestors, Cro-Magnon man, and not us. This is the same basic situation that is unfolding around the globe, with some being more successful than others. Given what little we know about this time, it appears that outside of reoccupying and claiming the ancient cultures and cities as their own, there wasn't much else that our ancestry did. They do not appear to advance much more socially, politically, or culturally once the people had reached the same level as the ancient cultures they had claimed as their own. Well, maybe more important is that throughout this time, many of these people not only claimed these cultures as their own, but they also began copying the ancient texts and stories, or at least the ones they thought that were important. But again, after they reached the same level of the ancients, they stopped and appeared to stay at the same level for at least the next few thousand years. In essence, they never actually created anything new. They appeared just to have copied what they had found. After thousands of years of this occupying the ancient cities and the general dark ages that had fallen upon humanity, the very next important event that begins starts approximately 1800 years ago with the revival of the last dominant religion that was dedicated to the Lord God faction. Although I'm going to primarily be focusing on the events in Europe and the Western world, you should be aware that this phenomenon of religious revival appears to occur all around the world at about the same time. Why this happened can't be exactly explained using traditional lines of thinking or scholarship. But with our new knowledge of the esoteric history of the mystical symbolism, we can speculate with some confidence that some type of contact or influence was beginning to occur once again between modern humans and the gods of our ancient ancestors. This is also the point in time that the historical sleight of hand begins to take place with the creation of the historical timeline we are all so familiar with today. This has been commented on many times by other authors, but we can go back and read from the learned fathers and educated Christians of the Catholic Church from this ancient time, where they speak of changing the historical timeline to fit the Catholic Church interpretation of the Bible and their general idea that the world was only about 6,000 years old. One of the best examples comes from the learned Christian scholar Uberus. Within his work, we are told how he directly cites the ancient Egyptian priest Manetho and provides a list of Egyptian gods and their time of rule over ancient Egypt that dated back tens of thousands of years. Within these records, it is reported that the enormous figure of 36,525 years for the entire duration of the civilization of ancient Egypt, from the time of the gods down to the end of the 13th and the last dynasty of mortal kings. In order to overcome this dating problem, the young scholar came up with an inspired solution, and I quote, "The year I take to be a lunar one, consisting of, that is, of 30 days, what we now call a month, the Egyptians used formerly to a year." As we all know and understand, the ancient Egyptians nor any other ancient culture did such a loony thing. But it did solve this embarrassing little dating problem for the Catholic Church. This allowed Uberus to take 36,525 years of Egyptian history and cram it into the Catholic Church's biblical interpretation that the world was only 6,000 years old by basically dividing it by 13. It is a little bit more complex than that, and I did explore that in an earlier video. But this little sleight of hand has been going on ever since. With our new understanding of this secret history of creation, we can now realize that this timeline of history that was provided by the Egyptian priest provides probably the more correct one. It also provides us with the interesting insight into the Christian fundamentalist belief that the world is only 6,000 to 10,000 years old. Although people who hold this belief tend to be mocked in our modern age of science and technology, we can now understand that this idea is not so crazy or odd as so many believe. It is in fact a general misunderstanding of the great destruction and collapse of the old world of the gods. We can now realize that this belief system remembers that we live in a new world, but they have clearly forgotten the reason why it's a new world. In Europe, this revival of the last dominant religion was, of course, the Roman Catholic Church. What is not generally known is that the Catholic Church was not the only institution that survived the collapse of the ancient world and the incredibly long dark ages that followed afterwards. Not only did this other institution survive the collapse, it somehow managed to preserve the ritual, ceremony, and the true meaning of the mystical symbolism. This almost forgotten institution came originally from what is more or less known today as the Roman College of Architects. This is the Roman institution that educated and trained the famous Roman engineers that built the impressive structures of the Roman Empire, much of which still survives today. To help make this easier to understand in our modern day terms, they were one of Rome's biggest and most powerful defense contractors. Over time, they became one of the most important teaching centers for all of Rome's military engineers and the architects that built Rome and the other cities around the empire. The single most important aspect that concerns us here is that the institution originally acquired their art and craft from the legendary Library of Alexandria once the Roman Empire had conquered Egypt. They not only learned the art and craft, but they also obtained the secrets and the proper use of the mystical symbolism from the scribes in Alexandria. In our modern world, it's very easy to understand how an institution like the Roman College would have had a vested interest in hiding their military knowledge from the general public and, more importantly, their enemies. It is also easy to understand how the general appeal of the secrecy and hidden ritual and ceremony of the scribes would have had on the military mind of the Romans and their idea of empire. It would have been more or less a perfect match between the groups with the added structure and discipline of the Roman military order. Just before and during the collapse of the vast Roman Empire, the Roman College began retreating to the city of Como in northern Italy, located on the southwest part of the Lake Como. It was and still is the administrative capital of the Italian province of Como. Here they reestablished themselves and managed to survive the collapse of the Roman Empire and the world in general. From what little historical information is available from this time, it appears that they survived by selling their building services to the surrounding wealthy patrons and landowners. They appear to have withdrawn and more or less hibernated through the long dark ages that followed the collapse, much as the Catholic Church had done. During this long, dark night, an air of mystery began to develop around this secretive group of master builders who kept the ancient rituals, ceremonies, and the mystical symbolism of the ancient world alive. In addition to keeping these ancient traditions alive, they also quickly became the only skilled craftsmen and builders available. Over time, they not only became the only skilled builders alive, they also were only of the few remaining people that could still read and write. Not only could they read and write, but according to the historical record, they never came under the control or influence of the Catholic Church. This allowed them to preserve an incredible amount of ancient knowledge. This combination of factors slowly led to this secretive group of builders to become known as the Comacine Masters. These master builders slowly over time became the basis of much of our modern idea of wizards or magical wise men of old who were thought to possess secret knowledge related to the old and ancient forgotten world of the gods. Where they start to become important in our modern world is when the Lombards, who came from northern Germany and entered and settled in northern Italy in the year we traditionally call 568 AD. As the Lombards began invading and settling the area, they encountered and they also prudently hired the Comacine Masters. This event did two important things. The first is that it helped make the Lombards a major military power at the time. And secondly, it breathed new life into the Masters. The next important milestone was when Charles the Great, better known as Charlemagne, destroyed the Lombards and declared himself as king of the Lombards. It is at this point in time that Charlemagne comes into contact with the Masters, and just like the Lombards before, he prudently hired them. But unlike the Lombards, Charlemagne had the Comacine Masters work for him exclusively and have them swear personal loyalty to them. By all known accounts, the Masters readily agreed and became faithful, loyal servants to Charlemagne. Soon after this, Charlemagne compelled the Saxons to submit to his rule and convert to Christianity. Thousands were beheaded when they were slow to choose between execution or baptism and the conversion to Christianity. After conquering the Saxons, Charlemagne then conquered much of what is today known as northern Spain, forming the largest unified empire in Europe since the days of ancient Rome. Not only did Charlemagne build the greatest empire since Rome, but he also thought it was his personal religious duty to raise the educational level of the clergy. This was so they could understand and teach not only the one true faith, but more importantly, that they could educate the masses that Charlemagne was the one true king under the law and rule of the church. This began what is now known as the Charlemagne Renaissance, which started a great awakening of culture in Europe. The primary focus of this Renaissance was the copyists preserving ancient texts which might never have survived. The oldest surviving manuscripts of many ancient Greek and Roman writers we have are in fact copies from this time. Charlemagne also began a massive building campaign across his empire. It is through this building campaign that the Masters were able to regain much of their wealth, influence, and power they once held under the Roman Empire all those thousands of years ago. This is most visible in the Roman style of architecture of the buildings that they constructed for Charlemagne. This is some of the more obvious evidence that the Masters had preserved the vast building knowledge of the ancient Roman Empire. It is also highly probable that many of the ancient Greek and Roman manuscripts that were copied at the time were directly supplied by the Masters. In order to perform this work and to attract new workers, it was necessary for the Masters to set up numerous meeting and training halls across Charlemagne's empire. These meeting halls became to be known as lodges. Not only did they meet in these lodges to discuss the building projects, but they were also there to perform and to teach the ritual, ceremony, and symbolism of the craft. This was done for the obvious reasons to help keep their craft hidden, but also for their fellow initiated workers. These original lodges and their rituals and ceremony can still be seen today in the structure of the many different lodges of modern-day Freemasonry, other similar esoteric brotherhoods. Shortly, we'll learn how the Freemasons came to have similar rituals as the Masters. The next important historical event for the Comacine Masters and their secret knowledge of the ancient world is when Charlemagne died and his kingdom was split between his three sons, as was the Frankish custom at the time. This quickly led to Charlemagne's kingdom fragmenting into several different kingdoms, which over the next 1,000 years slowly became the modern-day people and nations of Europe as we know them today. For the Masters, the death of Charlemagne and the collapse of the kingdom was devastating to him. They had the overall effect of totally shattering the unity that existed between the Masters, and they fractured into numerous different groups that became cut off from one another. This is also the point in time where the Comacine Masters began to disappear from the pages of history and transform into something completely different. It appears that soon after the death of Charlemagne, the Masters broke into three primary groups. Then, over time, these three primary groups then broke up into an unknown number of smaller groups with different ideologies and goals from all the others. The first of these groups began focusing more on the actual construction and business side of building than on the ritual and ceremony. Many of these groups go on to become the common stonemasons and builders of the time. These early stonemasons of Europe built much of the foundation of what would become known as the guild system of Europe 1,000 years ago. These common stonemasons and other craftsmen that focused only on the building aspects become known as operative craftsmen or masons because they operated in the actual trade and craft of constructing buildings. The second group, which also becomes the most important of the three groups, basically abandons the entire construction aspect of the Masters. They become primarily focused on the ritual, ceremony, symbolism, and the hidden knowledge that it all holds. These groups quickly become known as speculative craftsmen or Masons because they speculate about the hidden knowledge contained within the ritual, ceremony, and symbolism of the craft and abandon the building side of the tradition. This speculative group, over the next few centuries, breaks into several smaller, more specialized schools of thought, focused on many different subjects and esoteric interests. Three of the most important of these speculative schools of thought that developed in the first few centuries after Charlemagne's death later become known and are remembered as Hermeticism, alchemy, and Kabbalah. Hermeticism comes from and develops into a religious, philosophical, and esoteric tradition that is very intimately connected with the ever-famous alchemy. These traditions primarily have the greatest impact on Western thought because they become the basis of modern scientific thought that gives way to the scientific revolution in the 17th century, which then gives birth to our modern world today. Many more are more familiar with alchemy and the idea that it was a proto-scientific philosophical tradition that was practiced throughout Europe, Africa, and Asia. The primary aim was trying to learn the different secrets on how to purify, perfect, and then transmute certain objects, including the human body and mind, but also trying to understand the physical world in the hope that you could get closer to the Creator. Alchemy is commonly remembered today as a strange, magical-like tradition of old wizard-like men trying to change lead into gold. But the truth is that this tradition of alchemy goes on to provide much of the foundation of the experimental science and chemistry, much like Hermeticism has in mathematics and philosophical thought, which all of this had a huge impact on our entire modern world of today. The final one, Kabbalah, is an esoteric tradition, discipline, and school of thought that originated in Judaism but was quickly incorporated into Western esoteric traditions. Unlike the other schools of thought, Kabbalah's definition tends to vary according to the tradition and those who are following it. Over the last 1,000 years, Kabbalah has a great impact on Western culture. It has been adapted by and used in some form by not only Western esoteric and occultic groups, but also by different Christian sects and more recently in the modern New Age movements. One of Kabbalah's greatest influences is the tradition of numerology, which greatly influenced a renewed interest in mathematics all over Europe. Not only did these groups have a huge influence on our modern world, but they also had a huge impact on the entire Western occultic and esoteric traditions as a whole. The third primary group that the Comacine Masters broke into tried very hard to continue both traditions of the Master Builders, practicing both the operative construction of buildings and the speculative side of the rituals and symbolism. These groups tended to continue siding with kings and the wealthy landowners of the time. They also began to ally themselves with the Catholic Church and become the master builders that constructed the great cathedrals across Europe. By the 13th century, these master builders became so wealthy and powerful that they were able to form powerful working and trade guilds that were called corporations and that were granted special rights by the Catholic Church and by local kings for them to enjoy exclusive exercise of the profession and all the profits that would be secured to them by their work. Not only in law, but the inability of others to violate it by degrees made for by the businesses or the crafts as they were called at the time. It was a legal and professional protection of not only of their business, but also of keeping the ritual, ceremony, and the symbolism protected by the process of initiation and apprenticeship that was governed and created by the corporations. Many of these corporations become known as master Masonic guilds. The highly skilled and most educated members of these Masonic guilds quickly become commonly referred to as Masons. The more independent and enterprising of these Masons became known as Freemasons. At this point in time, these Freemasons who typically were the oldest and most experienced members of the corporate guild, could freely move about between the different lodges of the guild to ensure that they were all following the proper traditions and rules of the guild. They were also typically allowed to establish new lodges and recruit new members into the guild as necessary. They also filled several other important functions for the guilds and tended to be kind of a hidden leadership of the corporations. It is out of these Masonic guilds of the Middle Ages that modern-day Freemasonry claims their origin. Although, as we will shortly learn, this claim may or may not actually be true. The last important group that came out of this time period are the poor fellow soldiers of Christ in the Temple of Solomon, more commonly known as the Knights Templar, or simply the Templars. The Knights Templar were a Catholic military order that was first established in 1119 AD, and the order quickly became the wealthiest and most powerful Christian military order throughout Europe. It grew rapidly in membership and political influence. They also became a favored charity and founded an early form of banking, which became a large part of the economic infrastructure throughout most of Western Christendom. They also built a number of fortifications across Europe and the Holy Land. The Templar Order was closely tied to the Crusades of the Holy Land, and when it was lost and the Crusades officially came to an end in 1291 AD, support for the order began to fade. Soon after, rumors about the Templars and their secret initiation ceremonies and what they did during their secret meetings began spreading. This, combined with the fact that a great number of wealthy families, kings, and early businesses of Europe were all in deeply debt to the Templars, began to create a general distrust of the order. At dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307 AD, a date some have linked to the origin of the Friday the 13th superstition, King Philip of France, who himself was deeply in debt to the order, took advantage of the situation. With the help of the Pope, who had his own reasons to fear the power of the order, King Philip had scores of Templars in France simultaneously arrested. Most were tortured until they gave confessions for the charges of heresy and blasphemy, and then they were burned at the stake. In 1312 AD, Pope Clement officially disbanded the order. Since their destruction, a great air of mystery have enveloped the order of the Knights Templar. There have been numerous and sometimes dubious claims, legends, and myths made about them over the years, and they range everything from the mundane to the absolutely fantastical. What is actually really important about the Templars is not really found normally within the mainstream history books, but it is there if you look for it hard enough. In particular, is typically found within the writings of the esoteric religious traditions, primarily the Freemasons. Although there are many claims about the Templars within the esoteric traditions, both historical and Freemason sources basically tell us the same thing. That one of the Templars' greatest enduring legacy is that they become the model for all other secret initiated orders, brotherhoods, and societies at the time, a tradition that we can still see today. This came about because of the impressive power, wealth, and influence that the Knights Templars came to enjoy. Other groups began copying them in the hope of equal success and wealth. By the time of their destruction, it appears that every other order, brotherhood, or learned society in Europe at the time had copied them in some way and had incorporated their general organizational structure of the Templars into their own groups. The next important legacy of the Templars comes almost exclusively from the writings and history of modern-day Freemasonry. In this Masonic history, we are told that while the Templars were in the Holy Land, they encountered several other secret orders and arcane esoteric brotherhoods. It is through this contact that the Templars are said to have acquired a vast amount of hidden esoteric knowledge that they brought back to Europe. It is this esoteric or recondite knowledge that they brought back during the Crusades that is thought to be the real treasure they had found, not some mystical or magical relic or artifact. What is truly surprising is that the Order of the Knights Templars are said to have encountered the mysterious group known as the Essenes during this time. What makes this so remarkable is the fact that the Masons were writing about and researching the Essenes centuries before they were discovered by mainstream scholars in 1946. What makes the Essenes so important is that they are the ones that originally laid claim to being the descendants of the builders of King Solomon's temple and citadel, and that they were the guardians of the temple and the protectors of its divine knowledge of the deity. Within the Masonic writings, we are told that the Essenes are little more than a simple Jewish sect that carry out the dogmas of their faith with an unusual strictness and observance. We are told it was intensely Jewish in its membership, its usages, and its doctrines, and not the proto-Christian sect so many believe it to be today. What makes them different than other Jewish sects is they were structured in a very similar fashion as the Knights Templar, but in a Jewish manner, not a Christian one. The Essenes were in essence a secret initiated Jewish brotherhood that lay claim to several different aspects related to the building of King Solomon's temple and citadel. They also lay claim to being the guardians of the secret symbolism, rituals, and ceremonies of the first temple and its divine knowledge. Divine knowledge that is said to have been first revealed to the builders of this most holy of buildings. They also kept the ancient tradition of the scribes alive by employing the use of the mystical animal symbolism and allegory to keep this divine knowledge hidden within their writings. It is rumored that the Essenes also had a number of books and texts that originally came from the legendary Library of Alexandria, and that many of these ancient books were either copied, acquired, or taken by the Templars. Although the Masonic writings never actually say it, it appears that many of the basic ideas, rituals, and claims of modern-day Freemasonry as a whole have their origin with the Essenes and the information the Templars received from them during their time in the Holy Land. It also appears that the Templars themselves incorporated several of the rituals and ceremonies for initiation of the Essenes into their own. This primarily took the form of replacing much of the Jewish practice with a Christian perspective with a focus on the Savior. It also allowed the Knights Templar to claim a much older tradition than the Catholic Church. This would have been and is still viewed as a great threat by the clergy and leadership of the Catholic Church, with their claims as being the only true keeper of the divine knowledge of the Savior. This knowledge helps explain some of the mystery behind the destruction of the Templars and the greater threat that they actually pose to the Catholic Church and their power. This brings us to the next important historical event that had a major impact and influence on all the different esoteric groups, brotherhoods, and societies across Europe: the Black Death, or the Plague. As most already know, the Black Death that swept across Europe from 1346 to 1353 is estimated to have killed anywhere from 30 to 60% of Europe's total population. It was one of the most devastating epidemics in human history. The world's population in general did not recover to pre-plague levels until the 17th century. Although the Black Death was devastating to the general population as a whole, it was downright destructive for the esoteric orders. Many of the secret groups were just completely wiped out by the plague when their entire memberships were killed by it. A few others appeared to have survived the Black Death, but their memberships were so vastly reduced that they were never able to fully recover. Many of these groups just slowly disappeared as the surviving members died off as the years rolled by. The larger corporations and the more powerful guilds managed to survive, but like the rest of Europe, they were vastly changed into different things by the Black Death. One of the biggest changes was their focus turned more on the business side of their tradition than ever before. The few groups that did manage to survive relatively intact either started becoming more open and mainstream with their knowledge, and this helped give rise to much of what we call the High Renaissance and eventually led to the Reformation, while others went underground, hiding from all but their own small memberships. This brings us back to our starting point from the beginning of our journey into the dream vision, the Book of Enoch, starting with the early 1400s when Europe began recovering from the devastating effects of the Black Death. In our next video, we'll pick up the rest of the story starting in the early 1400s up to our own modern time, with a special look at one of the most misunderstood groups of all time, the Order of the Illuminati. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button below and subscribe for future videos.